Fame has a way of creating illusions. To the public, it often looks like a dream come true. Bright lights, adoring fans, headlines filled with success. But behind the curtain, there's always another side, a hidden story that never makes the glossy magazine covers. Every artist who reaches the top has a trail of secrets, controversies and scars that most people never hear about. And that's where the real story begins. Because what really keeps people watching isn't the perfect image, it's the messy, complicated truth hiding beneath it. The truth that shows fame doesn't come without sacrifice, that every rise carries shadows no one sees until they're too big to ignore. Imagine reaching everything you thought you ever wanted, only to realize the world is watching your every move, waiting for you to slip. That's the reality most stars live with, and it's where their stories get truly interesting. This journey isn't about polished moments or rehearsed interviews. It's about the shocking twists, the betrayals that cut deeper than the applause, and the rumors that spread faster than the music itself. Fans think they know their idols, but the truth is that what they see is carefully crafted, while the unfiltered story hides in whispers, leaked headlines, and behind closed doors. The story we're about to uncover isn't just another timeline of success. It's the unraveling of a persona, the rise, the cracks, and the shocking revelations that followed. And each step of the way, there's something unexpected, something that makes you question whether the image you've been shown was ever real at all. So buckle in, because this isn't just about the highs of fame. It's about the hidden struggles, the rumors that refused to die, and the controversies that revealed a very different truth. And once you see it, you'll never look at them the same way again. Every legend begins somewhere, but the start of this story isn't the picture-perfect rise people like to imagine. Before the flashing cameras, the screaming crowds, and the industry deals that would one day define a career, there was a world that looked far more ordinary, yet behind that ordinariness were the first hints of ambition, resilience, and struggle that would one day fuel the journey. Early beginnings always matter, not because they predict the outcome, but because they reveal the foundation that fame is built on. And in this case, those beginnings were filled with contradictions. On the surface, it was a childhood that could have looked familiar to anyone. School, family dynamics, the usual dreams of being something greater than what the environment offered. But underneath, there were tensions, challenges, and moments that revealed just how badly this person wanted out, how desperately they wanted more than just an average life. Those around them may not have seen it clearly at the time, but looking back now, it's obvious that ambition was there from the start. From an early age, they gravitated toward music and performance, not in a casual way, but with a hunger that set them apart. While friends were focused on day-to-day distractions, they were watching every move of the artists on TV, memorizing lyrics, practicing in private, and imagining what it would be like to stand on a stage. But it wasn't all passion and play. There was also pressure. Every great story has the moment when someone feels out of place in their own world, when their dreams clash with the reality of the environment around them. For some, that environment is supportive. For others, it's hostile. And in this case, it was complicated. There were supporters who believed in the talent, but there were also doubters, critics, and voices that tried to pull them back down to reality. That push and pull created a kind of fire, a stubborn drive to prove people wrong, and that fire would later become one of the most defining traits of their career. Money was tight, opportunities were scarce, and every step forward seemed to come with 2 steps back. This isn't the glamorous part of the story, but it's the most important, because this is where resilience was forged. They had to learn early that nothing would be handed to them, that success wouldn't come by waiting but by chasing it relentlessly, even when it meant being underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. This stage of life was filled with small performances, makeshift studios, late nights of writing, and endless rejection. For most people, rejection kills the dream. For them, it did the opposite. Every no became fuel, every obstacle a reminder that the only way out was to keep pushing until a door finally cracked open. And yet, there were moments of doubt too, times when it felt like giving up would have been easier, when the dream seemed too far out of reach. But even in those dark moments, something kept pulling them back. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was a fear of being ordinary, maybe it was something deeper, an unexplainable certainty that they were meant for something more. Whatever it was strong enough to keep them going, even when everyone else would have walked away. These early years weren't just about music or fame, they were about survival. Balancing school, side jobs, family responsibilities, and the endless hustle of trying to break into an industry designed to keep outsiders out. was more than a challenge. It was a test of character, and looking back, it's clear that this struggle was the crucible that shaped them. Without it, the later controversies, the sudden fame and the public scrutiny might have broken them entirely, but because of this foundation, they had already been tempered by hardship long before the world ever knew their name. There are stories, of course, the ones whispered by friends from those days, about how even then, there was something magnetic, something that drew attention whether people wanted to give it or not. A voice that stood out, a confidence that seemed too bold for someone so young, and a determination that made others feel uneasy, as if they were watching the beginning of something unstoppable. That magnetism was both a blessing and a curse. It opened some doors, but it also painted a target, creating envy and skepticism that would follow them for years to come. But here's the part that fans often don't realize. Those early years weren't just about practicing music or building skills, they were about learning the game of perception. They learned quickly that talent alone wasn't enough, that image mattered, that charisma mattered, and that knowing when to push and when to hold back could mean the difference between being ignored and being noticed. Even before the spotlight found them, they were already studying the art of control, shaping how people saw them, testing out personas and preparing for the day when the world would finally pay attention. And then came the first break. Not the big one yet, but just enough to prove that the dream wasn't impossible. Maybe it was a small performance that drew unexpected attention. Maybe it was a demo that circulated more than anyone expected. Maybe it was just the right person noticing at the right time, but whatever it was, it cracked open the door just enough for them to push a foot through. That moment didn't make them a star, but it changed everything, because now there was proof that the dream could cross into reality. From that moment on, failure was no longer an abstract fear, it became a challenge to be outrun. But this first break also brought the first real taste of pressure. It's one thing to dream in private, another to be noticed, and yet another to realize that people are now watching, judging, and expecting more. With that attention came new critics, new challenges, and the first hints of the controversies that would later define much of their career, because once you step into the light, even a little, the shadows start to grow deep. Looking back, it's almost eerie how much foreshadowing was packed into those early days. The ambition, the struggles, the magnetism, the criticism, it was all there from the start, like puzzle pieces waiting to snap into place once fame came crashing down. And while fans today might only see the headlines, the scandals, or the glory, the truth is that the foundation of everything good and bad was built here, in these early beginnings. Without this part of the story, the rest doesn't make sense. But if you think these struggles were the hardest part, think again, because as soon as the breakthrough came, the pressure multiplied, and what looked like success on the outside was already beginning to unravel behind the scenes. The early battles had been about survival. The next battles would be about control, and that fight was only just beginning. The moment of breakthrough is always painted as the happiest chapter in any star's story, but in reality it's never as simple as the dream finally coming true. For the subject of this journey, that first surge of recognition felt like a door being kicked wide open after years of banging on it from the outside. Suddenly, what once felt impossible was real. Songs that had been whispered in small rooms or performed in front of a handful of people were now echoing on larger stages, catching the attention of the industry and, more importantly, of an audience that was hungry for something new. There wasn't overnight success, even if that's how it looked from the outside. It was years of grinding that finally burst into public view. But as exciting as it was, it also carried the seeds of the challenges to come, because with every new admirer came someone watching closely, ready to tear it all down. The first brush with fame often comes with a rush of adrenaline. The interviews, the headlines, the first sold-out crowd, the first checks that feel bigger than anything that came before. And yes, those moments were real, and they were intoxicating. But fame is tricky, because it doesn't arrive in pure form, it arrives with strings attached. That initial attention quickly shifted into expectations. Fans wanted more, the industry demanded more, and suddenly the person who once begged for any kind of opportunity was now drowning in them. Success in its rawest form isn't freedom, it's a cage built out of pressure, and in those early days of breakthrough, that cage was starting to close in. What the public saw was a rising star, someone climbing the charts and appearing everywhere. What they didn't see was the exhaustion behind the scenes, the endless cycle of interviews, rehearsals, shows and studio sessions that blurred together until days and nights lost meaning. Friends and family would talk about how it felt like they had disappeared into a machine, visible everywhere but personally more distant than ever. This is the paradox of fame. The world feels like it knows you, but the people who actually knew you feel like they've lost you. And for this artist, that paradox hit hard, because fame was all-consuming. Then came the rumors. Because no breakthrough is ever clean, people began to question whether the sudden rise was as organic as it seemed. Was it pure talent that put them on the map? Or was there industry influence behind the curtain? Whispers of secret deals, industry backing, or personal connections began to swirl. And while none of it was ever confirmed, the speculation itself was enough to cast shadows on the spotlight. It didn't matter whether the rumors were true. Once a seed of doubt is planted in the public's mind, it grows like wildfire. Some fans didn't care, but others began to question whether they had been manipulated, whether the story of the underdog rising was just another carefully crafted industry narrative. The controversies didn't stop there. Fame magnifies everything, and suddenly every personal choice, every friendship, every mistake became fodder for gossip blogs and online debates. A night out could spark headlines the next morning. A single photograph could be twisted into a scandal, and with social media amplifying everything, the noise was relentless. But here's the thing, sometimes that noise helps. Controversy, no matter how nethic, often drives more attention than success alone, and in those breakthrough years, attention was the most valuable currency. It didn't matter if people loved or hated, they were talking, and that conversation kept the name alive in ways that polished promotion never could. But the pressure wasn't just external. Internally, there were cracks forming. With success came a new circle of people, managers, promoters, collaborators, some supportive, others opportunistic. The problem with sudden fame is that it attracts everyone, including those who see you not as a person but as a ticket to their own success. Friends from before fame began to fade away, replaced by new faces whose loyalty was always in question. Stories from those close at the time talk about the paranoia, the feeling of not knowing who could be trusted, and the weight of carrying that uncertainty on top of the already crushing schedule. The fame that once felt like freedom was starting to feel like chains. And yet, through it all, the artistry shone. Performances were electric, songs resonated with audiences, and the persona being crafted on stage seemed untouchable. Fans saw charisma, energy, and success. What they didn't see were the sleepless nights, the breakdowns behind closed doors, the toll that living up to an image was already taking. Fame demands perfection, but perfection is impossible, and once the cracks started showing, the critics were waiting. The media loves a rise, but it loves a fall even more. And as soon as the first signs of struggle appeared, headlines turned sharp. Was the star already losing control? Was fame too much too fast? Rumors of clashes with collaborators, disputes with management, and reckless behavior began to surface. Some were exaggerated, others had a kernel of truth, but all of them painted a picture that was far messier than the clean image fans wanted to believe. And this is where the story of breakthrough fame becomes complicated, because success isn't just about being talented, it's about managing perception. And perception was slipping. But what made this chapter so gripping is that it wasn't just the controversies, it was the resilience. Every rumor, every headline, every criticism was met with more music, more performances, more undeniable proof of talent. The very struggles that could have ended the career seemed to fuel it, adding a layer of defiance to the artistry that fans found magnetic. It's why, even as the scandals piled up, the following grew. People weren't just watching the music anymore, they were watching the chaos, the unpredictability, the sense that anything could happen next. Fame had become a spectacle, and in the spectacle, the star became bigger than ever. And yet, beneath that spectacle was a dangerous truth. Fame is not sustainable at that pace, not without consequences. The constant pressure, the endless scrutiny, the blurred line between personal and public, it was all building towards something. What the public didn't realize was that the breakthrough was just the first act. The real story, the darker story, was about to unfold, because success doesn't end the struggle, it multiplies it. And what came after this breakthrough would expose more than anyone was ready to believe. Scandals are the turning point in almost every celebrity story, the moment when the spotlight that once seemed so flattering transforms into a harsh glare, illuminating every flaw and every misstep. For the subject of this story, the scandals weren't just small stumbles, they were seismic shifts that sent shockwaves through the fan base and the industry alike. What makes scandals so captivating is that they blur the line between truth and speculation, feeding a cycle where the public can't look away, even when they claim to be disgusted. And in this case, once the first rumors gained traction, they opened the door to an avalanche of controversy that would forever change how people viewed the star. It began subtly, as it always does. Small stories appeared on blogs, whispers spread through fan circles, and anonymous sources claimed to have inside knowledge. At first, these were easy to dismiss, just the usual noise that comes with fame. But then came the first scandal too big to ignore. Whether it was a leaked argument, a questionable decision in public, or an accusation made by someone close, it was enough to grab headlines and dominate conversations. The media seized on it, instantly, and within days, the story was everywhere. For fans, it was a shock. For critics, it was vindication. Suddenly, the image of perfection cracked wide open, and what lay beneath wasn't as polished as people thought. But scandals don't exist in isolation. Once the door is opened, every action, past or present, is re-examined. Old photos, forgotten interviews, vague social media posts. Everything became evidence in a trial carried out by public opinion. Every detail, no matter how small, was twisted into a larger narrative. And while some of the accusations held truth, others were exaggerations, distortions, or outright fabrications. The problem is that once a reputation is tainted, no one cares about the difference. Perception becomes reality, and the scandals quickly snowballed into something far bigger than the original spark. Fans reacted in waves. Some defended fiercely, arguing that the stories were blown out of proportion or manipulated by jealous rivals. Others turned away, disillusioned by the idea that their idol wasn't the person they thought. Online battles raged across forums and social media, dividing once united fan bases into factions. The very people who once screamed the loudest in support were now the same people dissecting the scandals for entertainment. And through it all, the star at the center of it faced the impossible task of controlling a story that was no longer theirs to tell. The industry, too, reacted quickly. Business partners grew cautious, endorsements hesitated, and collaborators questioned whether association was worth the risk. Fame is fragile, and in an industry where image is everything, scandals can cut deeper than any artistic failure. Behind closed doors there were meetings, damage control strategies, and debates about how to respond. Should there be apologies, denials, silence? Each option carried risks, and none could guarantee redemption. Because scandals don't just damage reputations, they shift power, and suddenly the star who had once been in control was at the mercy of narratives they couldn't escape. What made this chapter even more intense was that the scandals weren't confined to one domain. They spanned personal relationships, professional conflicts, and even rumors about behavior that fans had never imagined possible. Each revelation seemed to build on the last, creating the sense of a downward spiral that no one could stop watching. The public loves a rise, but it loves a fall even more, and now every news story was consumed with morbid fascination. People who had never paid attention before suddenly knew the name, not because of the music or the talent, but because of the controversies. Fame, in this moment, turned into infamy. But perhaps the most painful part of the scandals was the betrayal. Many of the accusations and rumors came from people who had once been close friends, collaborators, even mentors. Some shared private details, others exaggerated encounters, and still others seemed to fabricate stories for their own gain. Whether driven by jealousy, revenge, or the lure of attention, these betrayals cut deeper than the headlines, because they turned trusted relationships into public weapons. To have your flaws exposed is one thing. To have them exposed by the very people you once leaned on is another. And for this artist, it created a sense of paranoia that would linger long after the scandals faded from the news. The media circus reached a point where every move became a headline. A simple night out was framed as reckless. A cryptic social media post was dissected for hidden meaning. Silence itself was treated as suspicious. The scandals had created a narrative of instability, and now everything was interpreted through that lens. Even when positive achievements happened, successful performances, charitable work, artistic breakthroughs, they were overshadowed by the darker stories. It didn't matter what was real anymore. What mattered was the story people wanted to believe, and in that moment the story was one of chaos, controversy, and decline. And yet, Through it all, there was still a sense of resilience. Even as the scandals raged, the music didn't stop. Even as the headlines painted a darker picture, the performances still drew crowds. This contradiction, public downfall paired with continued artistry, kept people hooked. Fans couldn't reconcile the two sides, the talent they admired and the controversies they couldn't ignore. That tension made the story even more magnetic, pulling more eyes, more debates, and more speculation. The scandals had shifted the narrative, but they hadn't ended it. If anything, they had made it more compelling. Looking back, this chapter feels inevitable. The hidden struggles from before had laid the groundwork, the cracks were already visible, and the pressure was too much to contain. The scandals weren't sudden, they were the eruption of everything that had been building behind the scenes. And while the public devoured the drama, what they didn't realize was how much pain lay underneath. For the star at the center, this wasn't just entertainment, it was life unraveling in front of millions. The question that lingered at the end of this chapter was simple but haunting. Could they survive it? Scandals destroy careers every day, leaving once bright stars forgotten and discarded. But sometimes, scandals become the fuel for reinvention, the fire that burns away illusions and forces a star to rise from the ashes, stronger than before. Which path this story would take was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: the scandals had changed everything. There was no going back to the innocence of the early years, no way to undo what had been revealed. The only way forward was through the storm, and the next chapter would determine whether survival was even possible. The aftermath of a scandal is often more brutal than the scandal itself. When the headlines fade and the gossip shifts to the next target, what remains is the damage, burned bridges, fractured trust, and a reputation that may never fully recover. For the star at the center of this story, Section 5 marks that brutal turning point, the moment when the consequences of everything that had unraveled came crashing down. It was no longer about denial or damage control, it was about survival. The first and most immediate impact was the shift in public perception. Fame is built on illusion, and once that illusion cracks, it's nearly impossible to repair. Fans who had once seen the artist as untouchable began to view them as flawed, vulnerable, or even dangerous. The aura of perfection, carefully cultivated by years of promotion and image management, had been shattered. And once the cracks were visible, people couldn't stop staring. Every action, every word, every new release was no longer seen in isolation, but through the lens of scandal. Even the smallest misstep was interpreted as proof that the star hadn't changed, hadn't learned, and was still spiraling. But the damage went far beyond fans. The industry itself reacted in ways that were swift and unforgiving. Opportunities dried up, invitations stopped coming, collaborators pulled back, afraid of being associated with controversy. Endorsement deals were quietly cancelled, tour schedules were suddenly postponed, and projects that had once seemed certain were shelved indefinitely. In an industry built on image, risk is everything, and now the star was seen as a liability. Behind closed doors, managers and label executives debated whether the career was even salvageable. Some pushed for rehabilitation campaigns, public apologies, charitable work, carefully staged interviews. Others suggested laying low and waiting for the storm to pass. But no one could agree on how long the storm would last or whether it would ever truly end. And then came the personal fallout, which in many ways cut even deeper than the professional losses. Fame is already isolating, but scandal takes that isolation to another level. People who had once been close began to distance themselves. Friends became silent, collaborators disappeared, and even family relationships grew strained. Trust, already fragile, felt shattered beyond repair. Every phone call, every text message carried the unspoken question: was this genuine, or was it going to end up leaked to the press? The paranoia deepened, and with it, the sense of loneliness. Fame had once been a dream, then a burden, and now it felt like a curse. But perhaps the most devastating part of this chapter was the internal battle. Shame is a powerful force, and when paired with relentless public criticism, it becomes almost unbearable. In private, the artist wrestled with self-doubt, questioning every decision that had led to this point. Was the fame worth it? Was the dream worth the cost? At the height of success, the price had seemed manageable, but in the wreckage of scandal, the toll was undeniable. Nights grew longer, sleep harder to find, and the weight of regret heavier with each passing day. What the world saw as spectacle was, for the person living it, a slow unraveling of identity. And yet, even in the darkest moments, there was a flicker of resilience. Because scandals, while destructive, can also be transformative. They strip away illusions, revealing the raw truth beneath. For some, that truth is too much to bear, but for others, it becomes the foundation of reinvention. In the ashes of a reputation, there lies the chance to build something new, something stronger, something real. And for this star, as much as the scandals broke them, they also forced a reckoning. The old image was gone, the old narrative destroyed. But in that destruction lay the opportunity for rebirth. The problem, of course, was timing. Reinvention doesn't happen overnight, and the world isn't always patient. Every attempt to move forward was met with skepticism. New projects were dismissed as attempts to distract from the past. Every public appearance was dissected for signs of sincerity or manipulation. The public wanted redemption, but it also wanted drama, and the line between the two was razor thin. One wrong move could reignite the scandals all over again, while too much silence could leave the star forgotten entirely. It was a balancing act that few could navigate, and every step felt like walking on broken glass. Financially, the impact was staggering. Fame often creates the illusion of endless wealth, but scandals have a way of draining resources quickly. Legal fees, cancelled contracts, lost opportunities, each one chipped away at the fortune that had once seemed untouchable. And with fewer projects moving forward, the income stream slowed to a trickle. Behind the glamorous facade, the reality was harsh. Bills still needed to be paid, lifestyles maintained, obligations met. The financial strain only deepened the pressure, creating yet another layer of stress on top of an already overwhelming storm. And yet, through all of this, the artistry never truly disappeared. Music, or whatever creative outlet drove the star, remained a lifeline. In the quiet of late nights, in the solitude of self-imposed exile, creativity became both therapy and survival. Songs poured out, raw and more vulnerable than ever before. Lyrics hinted at regret, at struggle, at the desperate search for redemption. Fans who managed to look past the scandals found themselves connecting to this honesty in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't the polished, manufactured perfection of earlier years. It was messy, imperfect, and deeply human. And in that humanity there was something magnetic. What made this chapter so fascinating is that it wasn't a clean fall. It wasn't the end of the story. It was a limbo, a period of uncertainty where everything hung in the balance. Would the scandals define the legacy forever? Or would they become just one part of a larger story of survival and reinvention? No one knew, not even the star themselves. All they could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, even when the path was unclear. And while the world debated, while fans argued and critics speculated, the truth remained hidden, because behind the headlines, behind the gossip, there was still a person, flawed, broken, but not defeated. The scandals had changed everything, but they hadn't erased the talent, the drive, or the possibility of redemption. This chapter, as devastating as it was, wasn't the end. It was the middle of a story that still had many twists left to unfold. What came next would determine everything. Because scandals can destroy, but they can also transform, and in the ashes of a shattered image lay the question that no one could yet answer. Was this the beginning of the end, or the start of something entirely new? Redemption is one of the most powerful narratives in any story of fame. It is the moment when the fallen figure claws their way back from the depths, fighting against doubt, ridicule, and the weight of their past, to reclaim something that was once lost. But redemption is not a single act. It is not one performance, one statement, or one apology. It is a process, often brutal, often humiliating, and always uncertain. For this star, Section 6 marks the beginning of that battle. The fight to prove not only to the world but to themselves that the story was not over yet. In the aftermath of scandal, the silence was deafening. For weeks, sometimes months, the star disappeared from the public eye, a self-imposed exile that left fans wondering whether they had given up entirely. Some called it cowardice, others called it strategy. But the truth was simpler. They needed to breathe. For the first time in years, there were no cameras, no flashing lights, no expectations, just the raw, uncomfortable reality of sitting with everything that had happened. And in that silence, the questions loomed large. Who were they without the fame? What did they truly want? stripped of the illusion and the performance. Could they ever stand in the spotlight again without crumbling under its weight? It was during these quiet months that the first sparks of reinvention began to appear. Creativity, the one constant even in the darkest times, returned like a lifeline. The songs written during this period were unlike anything they had done before. Gone was the polish, the carefully manufactured perfection designed to appeal to everyone. In its place was something raw, vulnerable, and deeply personal. Lyrics bled with regret, but also with resilience. Melodies carried pain, but also determination. For the first time, it wasn't about creating hits. It was about survival, about putting into words what couldn't be spoken aloud. As the vault of new material grew, so too did the urge to return. But returning was not simple. The world hadn't forgotten the scandals, and the media was waiting, ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. A comeback would require strategy, not just talent. Managers debated endlessly about the best approach. Should it be a surprise drop, letting the art speak for itself? Should it be paired with a high-profile interview, where the star could finally tell their side of the story? Or should it come quietly, testing the waters before risking the full weight of public opinion? Every option carried risks, and every path was lined with potential disaster. In the end, it wasn't strategy that sparked the return, it was necessity. A small performance, almost accidental, became the first step. Perhaps it was a guest appearance at a local venue, or an unannounced collaboration that slipped into the public ear. Whatever the case, it reminded people of what had always been undeniable: the talent. Stripped of scandal, stripped of image, the artistry still stood. And for some fans that was enough. Slowly, whispers of a comeback began to spread. The narrative shifted, if only slightly, from one of downfall to one of possibility. But redemption is never smooth. With every step forward came backlash. The first major release after the scandals was dissected mercilessly. Critics called it insincere. Fans debated whether the vulnerability was real or just another performance. Interviews were twisted, apologies mocked, gestures of change dismissed as PR stunts. The star was trapped in a cycle where no action could ever be enough, where the past loomed larger than the present, and yet beneath the noise there was progress. A new generation of fans, less tied to the scandals, began to discover the music. Old fans, tired of the endless drama, quietly returned, drawn back not by headlines but by the art. What made this period so gripping was the tension between perception and reality. Publicly, redemption seemed impossible, a Sisyphean task where every effort slid back under the weight of criticism. But privately, small victories piled up. Collaborators who had once distanced themselves began to return, intrigued by the raw honesty of the new work. Industry figures who had written them off started to reconsider, seeing the potential for a reinvention story that could be just as profitable as the rise that had come before. And within the star themselves, the fire began to burn again. Not the desperate hunger for fame of the early years, but something purer, a desire to create, to connect, to prove that they were more than their mistakes. The turning point came not from a carefully crafted PR stunt, but from authenticity. A song, raw and unfiltered, struck a chord in a way no one expected. It wasn't the polished hit the label had hoped for, but it was fans connected to it. Critics grudgingly acknowledged its power, and suddenly the narrative began to shift. The story was no longer just about the scandals. It was about survival. It was about resilience. And in that shift, redemption began to feel possible. Of course, the ghosts of the past never fully disappeared. Every success was still accompanied by reminders of what had happened before. Every headline celebrating a return was paired with a footnote about the controversies. The star would never fully escape their past, and perhaps they never should. But what they discovered was that redemption doesn't mean erasing the past. It means owning it, learning from it, and building something stronger because of it. And slowly, painfully, that is exactly what they began to do. The comeback was far from complete, but the direction was clear. The story had shifted from scandal to survival, from downfall to defiance. Fans who had once turned away now found themselves rooting for redemption. Even critics, hardened by years of skepticism, couldn't deny the power of someone who refused to be destroyed. And as the momentum built, one thing became undeniable: the star was not finished. The scandals had nearly ended everything, but they had also sparked something new, something raw, something real. And in that new chapter lay the possibility of a legacy not defined by downfall, but by the strength to rise again. This is the heart of Section 6, the messy, uncertain, brutal process of clawing back from the abyss. Not polished, not perfect, but human. And in that humanity lies the reason people couldn't look away, because deep down, everyone wants to believe in redemption. Everyone wants to believe that no matter how far someone falls, they can find a way back. And in this story, that belief was no longer just a fantasy. It was becoming reality, one painful, defiant step at a time. Redemption may begin with a spark, but sustaining it is a war, and wars are never won overnight. Section 7 marks the stage where the fragile beginnings of a comeback collide with the harsh realities of an unforgiving industry, and an audience that can't decide whether to embrace or reject the new chapter. For the star at the center of this story, this was the point where every victory seemed to come paired with a setback, where every step forward was met with a reminder of how much work remained to truly reclaim, not just a career but a sense of identity. The first major hurdle was proving consistency. A single heartfelt song, a single powerful performance, can capture attention, but attention is fleeting. To hold it there had to be more. Fans wanted a body of work, something that showed growth rather than a lucky strike. Industry figures, always cautious, demanded proof that the scandals weren't going to resurface and sabotage investments. And internally, the star needed to believe in themselves again, to trust that the raw emotions fueling their work weren't just temporary bursts of energy, but the foundation of something sustainable. It was here that the grind returned, not the glamorous version of the grind that comes with rising fame, but the grueling, lonely grind of rebuilding from near rock bottom. Studio sessions stretched late into the night, sometimes fueled by desperation, other times by a stubborn refusal to give up. The music being created during this period wasn't polished to perfection, it was raw, experimental, even messy. But in that messiness lay something magnetic, a kind of honesty that fans hadn't seen before. Songs bled with the contradictions of the moment, hope laced with bitterness, resilience scarred by pain, ambition shadowed by fear. For some it was the best work of their career, because it wasn't about chasing hits or trends, it was about truth. But honesty is dangerous in the world of fame, because it invites vulnerability, and vulnerability invites criticism. The first full project of this redemption arc arrived with enormous anticipation, not because people believed in the star's return, but because they wanted to see whether they would succeed or fail. Every lyric was dissected, every interview scrutinized, every chart position debated endlessly. The release didn't hit the same dizzying highs of earlier success, but it wasn't a flop either. Instead, it carved out a middle ground, a sign that while the star wasn't fully back on top, they weren't gone either. For some fans, that was enough. For others, it was proof that the scandals had left permanent scars. Public reception remained a battlefield. One half of the internet rallied around the star, praising the honesty and resilience, celebrating the courage to keep going in the face of relentless criticism. The other half mocked every move, dredging up old scandals and insisting that no amount of artistry could erase the past. This polarization became a defining feature of the redemption years. Unlike the early days, where adoration was near universal, now the star existed in a space of constant debate, and ironically that debate kept them relevant. People couldn't stop talking, not always positively, but always with fascination. Behind the scenes, the struggles were no less intense. Management teams shifted, collaborators came and went, and trust remained elusive. Some people saw the redemption arc as an opportunity, a chance to profit from the drama by attaching themselves to the narrative of resilience. Others genuinely believed in the artistry and wanted to help rebuild something meaningful. Sorting out who was genuine and who was opportunistic became another exhausting layer of the journey. Fame is never simple, but rebuilding fame after a fall is like walking through a minefield where every step could be the one that blows everything up again. And yet, through it all, the performances remained electric. On stage, stripped of headlines and controversies, the star commanded attention in ways that reminded everyone why they had risen in the first place. The live shows, smaller than before but more intimate, carried a new energy, a rawness, a vulnerability, a connection that hadn't existed during the polished heights of early fame. Fans described these performances as transformative, moments where the music cut through all the noise and made them believe again. And slowly, word spread. This wasn't just about a comeback, it was about evolution. But the ghosts of the past didn't stay quiet. Journalists continued to bring up old scandals in every interview. Headlines never failed to mention controversies even when covering new successes. Social media, with its unforgiving memory, resurfaced clips and stories at the worst possible moments. For the star, it felt like dragging a ball and chain everywhere they went. No matter how far they tried to move forward, the past was always waiting to pull them back. Redemption, it turned out, wasn't about escaping the past. It was about learning to live with it in full view of the world. What made this chapter especially difficult was the personal toll. The effort to rebuild meant constant vulnerability, constant exposure to criticism, and constant pressure to prove that every move was authentic. That kind of scrutiny wears down even the strongest, and there were moments where the star considered walking away altogether. The temptation to retreat permanently, to live outside the spotlight, was strong, but each time, something pulled them back. The music, the fans who still believed, the defiant urge to prove everyone wrong. That stubborn resilience became both a curse and a lifeline. And then came a breakthrough moment. Perhaps it was a collaboration with another respected artist, perhaps a viral performance clip, perhaps a song that unexpectedly resonated on a massive scale. Whatever it was, it reignited momentum in a way no one could have predicted. Suddenly, the conversation shifted again. Critics who had written the star off began to acknowledge the artistry. Fans who had drifted away returned, drawn by the undeniable energy of the new chapter. It wasn't a full redemption yet, but it was proof that redemption was possible. And in that moment, the star realized that the fight wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about legacy. The lesson of Section 7 is that redemption isn't a clean arc. It's not a straight line from downfall to glory. It's messy, filled with setbacks, criticism, and constant reminders of failure, but it's also filled with resilience, creativity, and moments of triumph that shine brighter precisely because of the darkness that surrounds them. For this star, the journey was far from over, but the fact that they were still standing, still creating, and still commanding attention was itself a victory. And as the curtain fell on this chapter, one thing became clear: the redemption story was no longer just about one person. It had become a symbol, a narrative that fans and critics alike projected their own hopes and fears onto. Everyone saw something in the struggle: the possibility of second chances, the cruelty of public judgment, the resilience of the human spirit. And that's why people couldn't look away, because deep down, redemption stories aren't just about stars, they're about all of us. Every redemption arc eventually faces its greatest test, the moment when the progress made collides with the weight of lingering doubt, when the fragile trust rebuilt with fans and the industry is threatened by forces beyond control. Section 8 captures this exact moment in the story, a stage where momentum seemed undeniable, yet instability lurked just beneath the surface, threatening to unravel everything once again. Because redemption is not a single triumphant return, it's a constant battle against memory, perception, and the ghosts of the past. And for this star, the fight was far from over. In the beginning, the signs were all positive. The new music was gaining traction, the live performances were becoming legendary in their intimacy and power, and slowly, doors in the industry began to reopen. Collaborations that had once been off limits were suddenly within reach, as other artists recognized the value in aligning with a figure whose story had captivated the world. There was a sense of excitement, a whisper that maybe this was the comeback everyone had been waiting for. And yet, beneath that surface excitement, cracks were forming, because with every success came increased scrutiny, and with scrutiny came the risk of collapse. The first challenge was the weight of expectation. Having clawed their way back into the spotlight, the star now faced the impossible task of living up to the myth of redemption itself. Fans didn't just want good music, they wanted proof of transformation. They wanted to see someone who had conquered demons, who had grown beyond their scandals, who embodied resilience in every word and every action. But human beings aren't symbols, and the pressure to embody perfection once again became suffocating. Behind the scenes, moments of weakness crept back in. Missed rehearsals, heated arguments with managers, old habits that resurfaced under stress. None of these were catastrophic on their own, but together they painted a dangerous picture, one that threatened to reignite the very scandals the star had worked so hard to escape. The media, ever eager for drama, pounced at the first sign of trouble. A late arrival to a performance became evidence of arrogance. A heated comment in an interview was spun into proof of instability. A night out with old friends sparked rumors that the star was slipping back into dangerous patterns. It didn't matter whether these stories were exaggerated or outright false. The narrative of relapse was simply too tempting for tabloids to resist, and once those headlines began circulating, they spread like wildfire, undoing months of careful rebuilding in a matter of days. For fans, the effect was devastating. Those who had rallied around the redemption arc felt betrayed, as though their belief had been taken advantage of. Others, who had always doubted the sincerity of the comeback, seized on the stories as vindication. Online, the battles reignited, with hashtags and debates tearing through social media. Was the star truly changed, or were they simply playing the role of redemption to stay relevant? The polarization that had defined the earlier years of scandal returned in full force, this time with even higher stakes. And yet, what made this chapter so compelling was that the cracks didn't erase the progress. They complicated it. Because while critics shouted about relapse, the artistry remained undeniable. The music released during this turbulent period was some of the most powerful, yet infused with the rawness of someone fighting desperately to hold on. Lyrics hinted at the tension between redemption and temptation, between growth and relapse, between the person the world wanted and the person they actually were. Fans who listened closely found themselves pulled deeper into the story, connecting not to perfection but to struggle. And in that struggle, there was something profoundly human. Behind the scenes, the pressure took its toll. Management scrambled to contain the fallout, to control the narrative, to present an image of stability even when chaos brewed underneath. Collaborators debated whether to stay the course or distance themselves once again, and the star, caught between the demands of the industry and the weight of their own demons, wrestled with exhaustion that bordered on despair. The very process of redemption, meant to heal, was threatening to break them all over again. But here's the paradox. The very instability that threatened to destroy the comeback also fueled its magnetism. People couldn't look away. Every headline, every rumor, every shaky performance or triumphant return became part of a larger saga that was as much about survival as it was about music. In an era where authenticity was both demanded and punished, the star embodied the contradictions of fame itself. They were both hero and villain, victim and perpetrator, inspiration and warning, and that duality made them more captivating than ever. The turning point of this chapter came with a performance that defied expectations. After weeks of swirling rumors and doubts, the star stepped onto a stage and delivered something unforgettable. It wasn't flawless, in fact. The imperfections were what made it powerful. Voice cracking with emotion, eyes heavy with exhaustion, the performance felt less like entertainment and more like confession. Fans who had doubted found themselves moved. Critics who had written them off admitted begrudgingly that the talent was still undeniable, and for one night, the redemption story felt alive again, burning brighter because of the darkness that surrounded it. Still, the question lingered. Was this enough? Redemption requires not just moments of brilliance, but consistency, and consistency was the hardest thing to maintain under such pressure. The battles with the past, with the media, with internal demons were ongoing, and no performance, no song, no interview could erase them entirely. What it could do, however, was remind the world why they cared in the first place, and that reminder was powerful enough to keep the story alive, even as doubt continued to shadow every step. What Section 8 reveals is that redemption is not linear. It is not a straight climb back to glory, but a jagged, uneven journey marked by setbacks, struggles, and moments of brilliance that shine even brighter in contrast to the chaos. For this star, the road ahead remained uncertain, but the fact that they were still standing, still fighting, still creating, was itself a kind of victory. The scandals had nearly destroyed them, the comeback had nearly broken them again, and yet here they were, raw, vulnerable, imperfect, and still undeniable. And perhaps that is the heart of redemption, not in proving perfection, but in embracing imperfection, not in silencing the ghosts of the past, but in learning to live with them, not in convincing the world to forget, but in showing the world that even with the scars, there is still something worth watching, worth listening to, worth believing in. The redemption story wasn't finished. It was still being written, one flawed, defiant step at a time, and that, more than anything, is what kept people hooked. Every redemption journey eventually arrives at the crossroads of stability and chaos, and Section 9 represents that turning point. After months of rebuilding, after clawing back piece by piece from the wreckage of scandals, the star finally began to taste stability again. The music was connecting, the performances were growing in scale, and the industry, cautious as always, was slowly warming back to the idea of supporting someone who had once seemed finished. But fame is never a smooth road, and stability is fragile. In the same way it takes years to build a career, but only one mistake to threaten it. The fragile equilibrium of these redemption years was constantly under siege by forces both internal and external. At first things looked promising. A major collaboration landed on the charts, bringing attention from an audience that had once turned away. Interviews became less hostile, with questions focusing more on the music and less on past controversies. Fans, both old and new, were starting to fill arenas again, proving that the magnetism hadn't faded. For the first time in a long time, the star felt a taste of what had once been their dream, the sense of being respected, admired, and celebrated purely for their artistry. But success has a cruel way of digging up old wounds, because with every step back into the spotlight came the shadows of what had once nearly destroyed them. The first crack in this new stability came not from the media, but from within. Pressure has always been the silent killer of careers, and now it returned with a vengeance. To the outside world, things looked steady, but behind closed doors, the weight was heavier than ever. Expectations weren't just about creating good work, they were about proving worthiness. Every song had to prove growth, every performance had to justify redemption, every interview had to show humility without appearing weak. It was an impossible standard, and one that left little room for error. The very process of proving stability became unstable, a cycle of overthinking, second-guessing, and exhaustion that gnawed at every waking hour. And then came the re-emergence of the past. Scandals, even when seemingly buried, never truly die. Old clips resurfaced online, reigniting conversations fans thought they had moved past. Anonymous voices reappeared, eager to remind the world of every mistake, every misstep, every controversy. Headlines, once cautiously positive, suddenly shifted tone again, questioning whether the redemption was real or merely an illusion. The internet, merciless as always, latched onto the resurfaced stories, spreading them with the same fervor as before. And once again, the star was trapped in the exhausting loop of trying to move forward while constantly being dragged backward. Fans reacted in ways that mirrored the earlier battles. Some defended, arguing that growth should not be invalidated by past mistakes. Others doubted, pointing to resurfaced evidence as proof that nothing had truly changed. The debates once again became part of the narrative, pulling the star's name back into trending hashtags and viral posts. And while the attention kept the story alive, it also risked undermining the very progress that had been made. Redemption had always been fragile, but now it felt like it could collapse entirely under the weight of memory. In the midst of this chaos, the artistry continued to serve as both weapon and shield. New songs addressed the tension directly, weaving past mistakes into lyrics that were raw and unapologetic. Fans who connected with the honesty felt as though they were hearing confessions, not performances. Critics, even when skeptical, acknowledged that the music carried a depth that hadn't been present before the scandals. And yet, authenticity alone couldn't erase the doubts. For every fan who praised the honesty, there was another who dismissed it as manipulation. Redemption, it seemed, was not about winning everyone back, but about surviving in the space between adoration and condemnation. The industry itself mirrored this split. Some collaborators leaned in, drawn by the energy of a star who was once again impossible to ignore. Others remained distant, unwilling to take the risk of association. Business decisions became complicated. Tours had to be carefully structured, and every move carried the potential for fallout. Behind the scenes, managers fought constantly to control the narrative, balancing the need for exposure with the risk of overexposure. And in the middle of it all was the star, pulled in a dozen directions, trying desperately to hold it together while the world seemed determined to unravel it all again. But what makes this chapter fascinating is that the cracks didn't signal defeat. They became part of the story itself. Fans weren't just watching for the music anymore, they were watching to see whether the star could hold on, whether they could survive the constant pressure, whether they could remain standing when everything around them threatened to collapse again. The instability became the spectacle, and the spectacle kept people hooked. In an age where authenticity is demanded, but scandal drives clicks, the star became both a symbol of resilience and a magnet for controversy, and paradoxically, that duality made them more relevant than ever. Then came a moment of triumph that silenced the doubts. If only temporarily, a performance grand, emotional, unforgettable reminded the world of the brilliance that had fueled the rise in the first place. It wasn't just about technical perfection, though the artistry was undeniable. It was about presence, about commanding a stage in a way that made people believe again, if only for a night. Fans roared, critics begrudgingly applauded, and for a brief moment stability felt possible. The redemption arc had weathered another storm, not because the past disappeared, but because the present demanded attention. Still, stability was never guaranteed. Even in victory, the questions lingered. Could this momentum last? Could the past truly stay buried? Could the star maintain the balance between vulnerability and strength, humility and confidence, redemption and authenticity? These were the questions fans asked, the questions critics debated, and the questions that haunted the star every single day. Section 9 isn't about a clean victory or a definitive downfall. It's about the fragile tightrope walk between the two, where every step could lead to triumph or collapse. It's about the paradox of fame, where stability is always temporary and chaos is always one mistake away. For this star, the redemption journey was not just about proving themselves to the world, it was about proving themselves to themselves again and again, every single day. And as the chapter closed, one truth became undeniable. The story was far from over, because in the world of fame, stability is never the final destination, it's only the calm before the next storm. Stability is a fragile illusion in the world of fame, and Section 10 marks the moment when that illusion is tested like never before. After clawing back from scandal, after surviving the backlash and rebuilding a shaky foundation of trust, the star stood at a point where everything felt possible again. The music was being heard, the performances were drawing crowds, and the industry was cautiously leaning back in their direction. For the first time in years, there was momentum, a sense that the redemption arc was finally tilting toward victory. But momentum is a dangerous thing. It creates expectations, it amplifies pressure, and it sets the stage for a test that can either solidify a comeback or shatter it beyond repair. At first, the signs pointed upward. A new project, teased with cryptic posts and hints of reinvention, sparked excitement across social media. Fans speculated endlessly, dissecting every clue, building anticipation to a fever pitch. The release arrived with the weight of expectation pressing on every lyric, every melody, every visual. It was not just an album, it was a statement, a declaration that the star had survived, evolved, and was ready to reclaim their throne. And for a moment it worked. The project debuted to strong numbers. Critics noted the honesty in the work, and fans celebrated the courage it took to confront the past while pushing into new creative territory. But success in this industry is never absolute. For every glowing review, there was a scathing critique. For every fan who praised the artistry, another dismissed it as self-indulgent or contrived. And once again, the fractures in perception began to widen. The backlash was swift and merciless. Detractors accused the star of capitalizing on their own scandals, of turning personal pain into spectacle for profit. Headlines declared the comeback overhyped, pointing to any dip in chart numbers as proof of decline. Social media amplified every criticism, creating a storm of negativity that threatened to drown out the genuine accomplishments. For the star, it felt like déjà vu. Just when stability seemed within reach, the tide turned against them again, threatening to undo everything they had worked for. But this time was different. Instead of retreating into silence, instead of letting the backlash define the narrative, the star fought back, not with angry words or desperate apologies, but with relentless creativity. New songs appeared almost immediately, rawer and more defiant than anything that had come before. Each release felt like a direct response to the criticism, a refusal to let detractors dictate the story. The strategy was risky, because oversaturation can kill momentum, but in this case it fueled a sense of urgency. Fans rallied, praising the resilience, while critics, though still skeptical, couldn't deny the sheer force of will being displayed. The live shows during this period became legendary. Gone were the massive stadiums of the early years. Instead, the star focused on smaller, more intimate venues where every performance felt personal, almost confessional. The connection with the audience was palpable, electric, and impossible to fake. Fans described leaving these shows transformed, carrying with them not just songs but the weight of an experience. Clips from these performances spread online, going viral not because of polish, but because of vulnerability. In a culture obsessed with spectacle, the star offered something different: authenticity, unfiltered and imperfect. Still, the challenges didn't stop. The industry remained divided. Some executives saw the potential for a long-term reinvention, while others insisted the star was too volatile, too risky to fully support. Opportunities continued to come, but always with hesitation, always with conditions. Endorsements were scarce, collaborations came with strings attached, and the financial pressure never fully lifted. Redemption stories may inspire audiences, but in the cold calculus of business, risk is rarely forgiven. And for the star, every deal felt like a reminder that no matter how far they had come, the shadow of the past still lingered. Personally, the toll was immense. The pressure to constantly prove worth, to constantly outdo every previous performance, weighed heavily. There were moments of exhaustion, moments when walking away seemed easier than continuing the fight. Friends described a cycle of highs and lows, ecstatic after a triumphant show, despondent after reading a negative headline. The instability that defined earlier chapters was still present, even if it was now hidden beneath the surface of apparent success. And in those private moments of doubt, the star questioned whether redemption was ever truly possible, or whether they were destined to forever chase approval that would never fully return. What made this chapter so gripping was the duality of it all. On one hand, the artistry was undeniable. The music carried depth, the performances carried power, and the star had proven resilience in the face of endless adversity. On the other hand, the controversies never fully faded, the criticisms never fully stopped, and the trust never fully returned. The star existed in a liminal space, celebrated and condemned, embraced and rejected, all at once. It was both victory and defeat, progress and stagnation, survival and struggle, and that contradiction is what made people unable to look away. Then came the breaking point, or perhaps the breakthrough, depending on perspective. A major event, maybe a televised performance or a high-profile award appearance, placed the star back in front of millions. The stakes were enormous. One slip could reignite every old criticism. One triumph could solidify redemption once and for all. The performance that followed was raw, defiant and unforgettable. Imperfect, yes, but powerful in a way that transcended technicality. It was not about flawless execution. It was about emotion, about presence, about proving that despite everything, they were still here, still fighting, still worthy of the stage. The audience erupted, the internet exploded, and for once the headlines were filled with praise rather than criticism. For the star, this moment felt like vindication. After years of chaos, after countless battles against doubt, scandal, and self-destruction, they had stood on one of the biggest stages in the world and reminded everyone why they mattered. But even in triumph, questions remained. Would this moment last, or would it fade like so many others before? Was this the turning point toward lasting stability, or just another peak before the next fall? The answers weren't clear, but one truth was undeniable. The star had survived yet another storm, and in survival lay a kind of victory that no scandal could erase. Section 10 is the chapter of ultimate test, where stability is challenged by backlash, where redemption is proven not in silence but in defiance, and where survival itself becomes the most powerful statement. The journey was still far from over, but by enduring, by continuing to create, by refusing to vanish in the face of relentless scrutiny, the star had carved out something stronger than perfection: resilience. And resilience, more than anything else, is what keeps a story alive. The very story of redemption eventually collides with the reality of consequences, and Section 11 captures that uneasy balance between newfound triumph and the hidden costs it carries. After the breakthrough moment, the star found themselves standing once again in the center of cultural conversation, not as a washed-up relic or a cautionary tale, but as a figure of resilience and defiance. The performance that reignited belief became more than just a viral clip. It was proof that even in the face of endless backlash, survival was possible. But the aftermath of victory was not the end of struggle. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that revealed just how expensive redemption can be, not only in terms of career but in the toll it takes on mind, body, and relationship. The days following the performance were filled with headlines that seemed almost surreal compared to the years of negativity. Media outlets that had once dismissed the star as irrelevant suddenly ran glowing profiles about their unbelievable comeback. Fans flooded timelines with praise, declaring their idol unstoppable. Opportunities began to resurface, with promoters and brands reaching out to test the waters once more. For the first time in years, doors that had long been shut creaked open, and yet, even in the light of this resurgence, shadows lurked close behind, because for every positive headline, there were still whispers of doubt, still reminders of the past, still critics waiting for the next stumble. Fame had not changed its rules. It had merely offered another chance, one that could just as easily vanish if not handled with perfection. Behind the scenes, the cost of this resurgence became impossible to ignore. The emotional and physical demands of maintaining relevance were brutal. The star's schedule, once empty and suffocating, was suddenly overflowing with obligations, performances, interviews, rehearsals, recordings, all stacked one after another with little time to breathe. On the outside, this looked like momentum, like proof of success, but privately, the exhaustion was crushing. Nights bled into mornings, rest was sacrificed for opportunity, and every public appearance carried the weight of scrutiny. The very thing they had fought for, the chance to matter again, now threatened to consume them from the inside out. The relationships around the star also revealed the complicated reality of this phase. Friends and collaborators who had distanced themselves during the darker times now began to reappear, offering support, advice, and partnerships. Some were genuine, thrilled to see their friends succeed again. Others were opportunistic, eager to ride the wave of relevance for their own gain. Trust once broken proved difficult to rebuild. The star found themselves questioning motives constantly, wondering who was truly there for them, and who was simply waiting for another chance to benefit. Fame has always been a lonely road, and even in triumph the loneliness persisted, amplified by the knowledge that loyalty is often conditional. And then there was the cost of vulnerability. The star had built their comeback not on spectacle but on authenticity, on exposing their flaws and weaving pain into art. This strategy resonated deeply with fans, but it came at a heavy price. To remain authentic meant constantly revisiting wounds, constantly reliving the very moments of humiliation and struggle that had nearly destroyed them. Every interview demanded reflection on the past. Every performance required tapping into scars that had barely healed. For the audience, it was powerful and cathartic. For the star, it was exhausting. A cycle of self-exposure that sometimes felt like tearing open old injuries for the sake of applause. The financial side of the comeback carried its own challenges. Success brought opportunities, but debts from the years of decline loomed large. Legal fees, cancelled contracts, and lost revenue had left holes that couldn't be filled overnight. Managers worked tirelessly to negotiate new deals, but every contract came with stipulations. Every brand partnership carried clauses to protect against future controversies. The star was valuable again, but still seen as a risk, and that constant reminder that redemption had limits in the eyes of business fueled frustration, even anger. They were celebrated in headlines yet treated with caution in boardrooms, a contradiction that mirrored the duality of their public perception. But perhaps the deepest cost was psychological. Living under the microscope, even after reclaiming some control, took its toll. The highs of adoration were intoxicating, but the lows of criticism were still devastating. Every negative comment online, every dismissive review, every whisper of doubt threatened to unravel the fragile confidence that had been rebuilt. Therapy sessions, once sporadic, became regular necessities, attempts to maintain balance in the face of relentless pressure. But therapy could only do so much when the demands of fame left little room for healing. The truth was simple but brutal. Redemption was not peace. It was war, fought every day against public opinion, industry politics, and private demons. And yet, despite the cost, there was undeniable progress. Fans who had once walked away were now fiercely loyal, admiring the star not just for their talent, but for their ability to endure. Younger audiences, who had missed the scandals of the past, discovered the star for the first time and connected without the baggage of history. Even critics, while still divided, acknowledged that the resilience itself was remarkable. The comeback wasn't perfect, but it was real, and in an industry built on illusion, reality carried power. What makes this chapter compelling is the paradox it reveals. Triumph and suffering, applause and exhaustion, victory and sacrifice, all coexisting at once. The star had proven survival, but survival was not free. Every day demanded a price: health, trust, stability, and the bill was always higher than expected. But rather than collapse under the weight, the star continued forward, step by step, fueled not just by ambition but by the belief that after everything they had endured, walking away would mean letting the darkness win. And in that refusal, in that relentless push to keep moving despite the toll, they embodied something that resonated deeply with audiences: the messy, painful, complicated truth of resilience. Section 11 is not about the glittering surface of a comeback. It is about the cracks beneath it, the hidden costs that fame demands, even from those who fight hardest to hold on. It is about the loneliness of success, the exhaustion of constant vulnerability, and the contradictions that come with being both celebrated and distrusted at the same time. And it leaves one lingering, unsettling question: how long can anyone survive this cycle before the price becomes too high? The answer was not yet clear, but one thing was undeniable: the story was far from finished. Because in the world of fame, every victory is temporary, and every triumph carries the shadow of the next test waiting just around the corner. The story of fame always circles back to the same unavoidable truth: survival alone is never enough. After the breakthrough moments of resurgence and the punishing costs that followed, Section 12 begins with the realization that reinvention is not optional. It is essential. For a star who had clawed their way back from the abyss, who had endured scandals, backlash, and the relentless pressure of redemption, the next challenge wasn't about proving survival. It was about proving evolution. Fans had cheered resilience. They had applauded vulnerability. But the industry demanded more. And in the unforgiving world of entertainment, standing still is the same as disappearing. Reinvention became the battleground, and every decision carried the potential to either solidify longevity or unravel everything once again. The first steps into reinvention were bold but uncertain. New creative directions were teased through cryptic posts, experimental performances, and unexpected collaborations. The star leaned into a sound and image that departed from the familiar, knowing that audiences were fickle and that the same tricks could not be repeated forever. This phase was not just about music or image. It was about identity, about reshaping how the world perceived someone who had already been written off once before. Reinvention required risk, and risk came with fear. Would fans embrace the evolution, or would they cling to the past? Would critics applaud innovation, or dismiss it as desperation? These questions loomed over every release, every move, every appearance. The reactions, as always, were divided. Loyal fans celebrated the courage to try something new, praising the creativity and depth of the evolving artistry. Younger audiences, unfamiliar with the older image, embraced the fresh persona without hesitation, finding in it something relatable and exciting, but not everyone was convinced. Critics accused the star of abandoning their roots, of losing the rawness that had fueled their initial comeback. Others dismissed the reinvention as a calculated gimmick, an attempt to chase trends rather than set them. The same contradictions that had defined earlier chapters resurfaced here: celebration and skepticism, praise and doubt, applause and backlash, all colliding at once. Behind the scenes, reinvention carried immense personal weight. To reinvent meant to shed old versions of the self, to leave behind parts of an identity that had once been essential for survival. It was painful, like cutting away pieces of history in order to grow. Friends and collaborators sometimes struggled to keep up, uncertain of where they fit in the new vision. Managers pushed for bold moves that might shock audiences, while the star wrestled with the fear of losing the core authenticity that had fueled their resurgence. Every meeting became a debate between risk and safety, artistry and strategy, authenticity and calculation. Reinvention was not just about creating something new, it was about tearing apart what had been, and that process was messy, complicated, and emotionally exhausting. The personal cost of this transformation was immense. Reinvention demanded not just new artistry, but new discipline. Hours in the studio became grueling marathons, every detail scrutinized, every sound dissected. Performances were reimagined from the ground up, demanding physical training, new choreography, and endless rehearsals. The body, already worn from years of pressure and punishment, struggled to keep up with the demands of reinvention. Injuries flared, exhaustion deepened, and the constant push toward perfection left little room for recovery. The toll was not just physical, but mental, as doubts crept in, whispering that perhaps this new path would never be enough to silence critics or secure a lasting place in the spotlight. And yet, in the midst of the struggle, there were moments of brilliance that hinted at the potential of this new era. A daring performance shocked audiences with its originality, going viral not because it was polished, but because it was unlike anything the star had done before. A collaboration with an unexpected partner introduced the artistry to an entirely new demographic, expanding reach in ways that once seemed impossible. These glimpses of success fueled hope, proving that reinvention, while painful, could carry rewards. Fans described feeling as though they were witnessing history in the making, the transformation of an artist willing to risk everything in pursuit of growth. But reinvention also attracted new controversies. With every bold move came backlash from those unwilling to accept change. Longtime supporters accused the star of abandoning them, insisting that the new image betrayed the authenticity they had once admired. Social media amplified the dissent, with debates raging between fans who embraced evolution and those who rejected it. Headlines alternated between celebrating the rebirth and questioning whether the star had finally lost their way. Reinvention, by its very nature, divided opinion, and the star found themselves once again at the center of polarizing debates. The industry watched closely, calculating the risks and rewards. Some saw the reinvention as a sign of longevity, proof that the star could adapt and thrive in a constantly shifting landscape. Others remained cautious, wary of committing fully until the new direction proved sustainable. Deals were signed, but always with hesitation, always with conditions. Every opportunity was laced with uncertainty, and the star knew that one misstep could turn reinvention into ridicule. The pressure was suffocating, because in this phase, the stakes were higher than ever. Failure would not just be a setback, it would be confirmation of every doubt, every criticism, every whisper that survival had been nothing more than temporary luck. Through it all, the star clung to one truth: reinvention was not optional. To stop evolving was to die in the eyes of fame. And so, despite the exhaustion, despite the backlash, despite the endless doubts, the push continued. Every performance became a declaration, every song a manifesto, every public appearance a chance to show the world that survival had given way to transformation. The process was messy, painful, and far from perfect, but it carried a power that could not be denied. Reinvention was not just a strategy, it was a necessity, a lifeline, a way to carve a future out of a past that refused to disappear. Section 12 reveals the truth that redemption is only half the battle. Survival may capture attention, but reinvention is what sustains it. For this star, the struggle was not about erasing the past, but about building a future strong enough to withstand it. The journey of reinvention was risky, exhausting, and filled with contradictions, but it also carried the potential to redefine everything. And as the chapter closed, one truth became clear: the reinvention was not yet complete. It was only beginning, and the world was watching, waiting, ready to decide whether this transformation would lead to lasting triumph or to another collapse. Reinvention had breathed new life into the career, but in the unpredictable world of fame, every rise seems destined to collide with another storm. And Section 13 captures the moment when progress met resistance in the form of scandals that no one saw coming. For a star already defined by survival and transformation, the emergence of fresh controversies was both familiar and devastating, because while old wounds had been turned into art, new ones had the potential to derail everything that had been built. It began subtly, with whispers online, cryptic posts hinting at behavior behind the scenes that didn't align with the carefully crafted reinvention narrative. At first, fans dismissed the noise as the usual chatter of jealous detractors, but soon the whispers turned into headlines, and the headlines into debates, until once again the star's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. The first blow came in the form of accusations, vague at first but enough to capture public attention. Blogs speculated, gossip channels dissected, and social media latched onto every detail with ruthless efficiency. The reinvention had painted the image of someone reborn, disciplined, and authentic, so the idea that cracks were already appearing fascinated audiences. The narrative of transformation was suddenly under attack, and skeptics eagerly declared the entire comeback a facade. The accusations, whether proven or not, gained momentum, because in the world of fame, perception often matters more than truth. The more the star tried to ignore the noise, the louder it became, until silence itself was treated as guilt. The timing could not have been worse. Major projects were in the works, tours had been planned, and endorsements depended on the image of resilience and reinvention. Suddenly, deals were paused, opportunities evaporated, and once again the star found themselves on trial in the court of public opinion. Fans were divided. Some defended passionately, insisting that no one could erase the progress that had been made. Others turned skeptical, questioning whether reinvention had been genuine or just another mask. The debates grew vicious, with former supporters publicly withdrawing allegiance and rivals using the moment to push their own narratives forward. Behind the scenes, the chaos was even more brutal. Management scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing statements carefully worded to avoid further backlash. Lawyers became involved, strategizing how to minimize damage while avoiding the appearance of guilt. Friends and collaborators caught in the crossfire had to decide whether to stand by the star or distance themselves for the sake of their own reputations. The loneliness that fame always carries deepened, because once again the star was forced to confront the reality that loyalty in this industry is conditional. And yet, what made this scandal different from the ones that had nearly ended the career years earlier was the star's refusal to crumble. Instead of hiding, instead of retreating into silence or despair, they responded with a kind of defiance that surprised everyone. Through music, through live performances, through candid words in interviews, the star pushed back, not with denial but with raw honesty. They acknowledged flaws, admitted to mistakes, but refused to let those mistakes define them. It was a dangerous strategy. Admitting fault can sometimes fuel more backlash, but in this case it resonated with audiences tired of polished lies. For many fans, the willingness to own imperfections felt refreshing, even humanizing. Still, the backlash did not disappear overnight. The media continued to feed on the controversy, dragging every old scandal back into the spotlight and stitching them together with the new. The reinvention narrative was under siege, tested in ways that seemed almost impossible to survive, but the very act of standing firm, of refusing to vanish, transformed the scandal into something else. A new stage in the story of resilience. The star became, once again, a lightning rod for debate, but also a symbol of defiance in a world that constantly demands perfection from imperfect people. The toll, however, was immense. Publicly, the star seemed composed, defiant, even empowered. Privately, the emotional weight was crushing. Nights were sleepless, days were consumed with meetings, rehearsals, and damage control. Friends described moments of breakdown, of overwhelming doubt, of questioning whether it was all worth it. Fame had always been a battlefield, but now it felt like a war fought on too many fronts at once, against critics, against the industry, against the internet, and against the star's own inner demons. Survival required strength beyond what most could imagine, and even then, survival did not guarantee peace. And yet, despite the chaos, the artistry never stopped. In fact, the scandals seemed to fuel some of the most powerful creative work of the star's career. Songs written during this period carried a rawness that could not be faked. Lyrics filled with pain, anger, and defiance. Performances were intense, unpredictable and unforgettable, as though every show was both a confession and a battle cry. Fans who witnessed these moments described them as transformative, proof that even in the midst of destruction, art could rise like fire from the ashes. Critics, too, begrudgingly acknowledged the brilliance, noting that controversy, for better or worse, had always seemed to sharpen the star's artistry. Section 13 reveals that reinvention, no matter how carefully constructed, is always vulnerable to the unpredictable storms of fame. Scandals, whether deserved or exaggerated, remain the currency of public fascination, capable of destroying years of progress in an instant. But it also reveals something more, that true reinvention is not about being flawless, but about surviving imperfection, about continuing to move forward even when the world insists on dragging you backward. The star's ability to turn chaos into creativity, to transform scandal into fuel, became the very thing that kept the story alive. The chapter closes not with resolution, but with uncertainty. As all the best stories of fame do, the star stood at a crossroads once again, with the future hanging in the balance. Would the scandals fade, allowing the reinvention to continue, or would the weight of controversy finally collapse the fragile structure of redemption? No one knew for sure, not even the star themselves. But one thing was undeniable: people were still watching, still debating, still captivated. And in the world of fame, where attention is the ultimate currency, that meant the story was far from over. Every rise and fall had carved scars too deep to ignore, and by the time Section 14 began, the Star realized that reinvention and survival alone were not enough. Scandals had threatened to undo everything, and though resilience had carried them through, the cycle of chaos could not continue forever. What mattered now was not simply clawing back attention or silencing critics. It was about creating something that could endure beyond the headlines. Fame is fleeting, and applause can vanish overnight, but legacy has the power to outlive scandal. For the first time, the Star shifted their focus from winning the next battle to building a foundation that could withstand any storm. The goal was no longer just to survive in the moment, but to leave behind a story that couldn't be erased. The journey toward legacy began quietly, almost in secret. While the public still argued over controversies, the Star retreated into the studio with a sense of purpose that hadn't been present in years. Instead of chasing trends or catering to the demands of labels, the work became personal again, rooted in the idea of creating something timeless. Songs poured out, not as attempts to prove redemption but as reflections of everything endured: betrayals, humiliations, victories, and scars. The music was darker, more layered, filled with truths that had never been spoken publicly. For once, the Star wasn't writing for applause, they were writing for permanence. And that change of focus shifted everything. As the new material took shape, so did a broader vision. Legacy was not just about music, it was about impact. The Star began investing energy into projects that reached beyond the stage, projects that could reshape how they were remembered. Mentorship became one of the most surprising steps. Younger artists, many of them struggling with the same industry pressures, began seeking guidance, and the Star, instead of brushing them off, opened the door. Sharing hard-earned lessons became both cathartic and powerful, a way to turn pain into something fans noticed, praising the Star not only for their artistry, but for their willingness to help others navigate the same unforgiving system. But building legacy was not without conflict. Critics remained skeptical, accusing the Star of using mentorship and outreach as image repair. Headlines questioned motives, suggesting every charitable act or community project was nothing more than PR. The Star pushed forward anyway, refusing to let cynicism dictate the path. Actions spoke louder than speculation, and with time, the consistency of the work began to change perceptions. Slowly, the narrative shifted from scandal-plagued Star to artist who refuses to be defined by mistakes. It wasn't redemption in the traditional sense. It was evolution, an acknowledgement that legacy is built not by erasing the past but by creating something bigger than it. The performances during this chapter reflected the same shift in focus. Gone was the desperation to prove worth in every show. Instead, the Star performed with a sense of freedom, embracing imperfection and prioritizing connection over spectacle. Audiences responded, describing these shows as transformative experiences rather than just concerts. The intimacy, the vulnerability, and the refusal to hide behind polish made every moment unforgettable. Clips from these performances went viral, not because they were flawless, but because they felt real, because they captured the raw essence of an artist no longer chasing validation, but simply sharing truth. Financially, the pivot to legacy also carried surprising benefits. Endorsements and brand deals, once scarce, began to trickle back, drawn not by hype but by the authenticity of long-term impact. Investors and collaborators who had once distanced themselves quietly returned, sensing stability in the new direction. The Star's willingness to step away from quick wins in favor of meaningful projects made them, ironically, less risky in the eyes of business. For the first time in years, stability seemed possible not just as a fleeting illusion, but as a sustainable path. Privately, however, the journey remained grueling. Building legacy required relentless work, not just on music or projects, but on the self. Therapy sessions continued, confronting traumas that had long been buried. Relationships had to be rebuilt carefully, with honesty and boundaries that hadn't existed before. Trust remained fragile, but with each honest conversation, each step away from toxic patterns, progress became visible. The Star's inner circle, though smaller than in earlier days, was stronger, rooted in loyalty proven during the darkest moments. That foundation, though imperfect, offered something fame had never provided: genuine connection. And yet, even in this era of growth, the shadows of the past lingered. Every public move still carried the potential for criticism, every slip magnified by an audience conditioned to expect collapse. The internet never forgets, and reminders of old scandals resurfaced periodically, threatening to undermine the progress made. But unlike before, these moments no longer derailed everything. Instead, they became part of the narrative, woven into the larger story of survival and transformation. Legacy, after all, is not about perfection. It's about endurance. The star's willingness to embrace this truth began to resonate deeply with audiences. Younger fans, discovering the artistry for the first time, admired the authenticity without the baggage of history. Older fans, who had witnessed the rise, the collapse, and the comeback, found inspiration in the sheer refusal to give up. Even critics, once relentless, began acknowledging the undeniable reality. The star had outlasted the scandals, the backlash, and even the industry's attempts to write them off. In a culture obsessed with overnight sensations, endurance itself became a revolutionary act. Section 14 captures this critical turning point, the moment when survival transforms into something larger, when reinvention gives way to legacy. It is not about erasing mistakes or pretending the past didn't happen. It is about creating something strong enough to live alongside them. For the star, this chapter was not defined by chart numbers or viral moments, but by the slow, deliberate process of building permanence in a world addicted to impermanence. The storms had not stopped, and the risks had not disappeared, but the focus had shifted, and with it the possibility of lasting impact emerged. The chapter closes with the sense that legacy is not a finish line, but a journey, one that demands constant evolution, constant resilience, and constant confrontation with the shadows of fame. The star had not found peace. Not entirely, but they had found purpose. And purpose, more than applause, more than headlines, more than fleeting redemption, was the first real sign that everything they had endured might finally mean something that would last. By the time Section 15 begins, the story of survival, reinvention, and legacy building has carried the star through more storms than most could endure in a lifetime. And yet the greatest test was still ahead. Fame is never satisfied with endurance. It constantly demands proof, a final demonstration that everything a star claims to stand for can withstand not just controversy and backlash, but the slow erosion of time itself. This chapter is not about the wild highs of a comeback or the devastating blows of scandal. It is about the question of permanence. Could the legacy built in blood, sweat, humiliation, and resilience hold steady when the spotlight inevitably dimmed? And more importantly, could the star live with who they had become when the roar of the crowd faded to silence? The closing act of this journey began with what looked like triumph. The projects tied to legacy, mentorship programs, authentic performances, community-driven work were gaining traction. Fans described feeling proud to support someone who had not only survived, but had grown into a figure who used influence for more than personal gain. Critics, once relentless in their skepticism, began to concede that the resilience itself was a kind of artistry. The narrative had shifted, subtly but powerfully, from one of scandal and redemption to one of transformation. But in the cruel rhythm of fame, this moment of stability only set the stage for the final storm. The storm arrived not as a scandal in the traditional sense, but as something more subtle, more insidious. Time. Younger stars were rising, hungry, innovative, and unburdened by the past. Social media platforms were filled with fresh faces, and trends shifted faster than even the most adaptive could follow. For a star who had spent years fighting to remain relevant, the realization that relevance itself was slipping away was devastating. The industry, ever pragmatic, began shifting attention toward the next wave, leaving the once headline-dominating figure to confront an uncomfortable truth. Survival and reinvention could not prevent the inevitable changing of the guard. At first the star resisted. More music was released, more performances staged, each one framed as proof that they still belonged. The work carried undeniable passion, but the audiences were smaller, the headlines fewer, the impact muted compared to the frenzy of earlier years. What had once been battles against scandal now became battles against irrelevance. And this fight was harder to win because there was no single opponent to confront. It was not about surviving controversy, but about surviving time itself. And time, as always, was merciless. The personal toll was immense. For years the star's identity had been inseparable from fame, every victory and every humiliation tied to the public eye. The thought of slipping into the background, of existing without the constant roar of attention, triggered fears that ran deeper than any scandal ever had. Who were they without the spotlight? What was left of them once the applause faded? These questions haunted every quiet moment, every empty room after a performance, every morning when headlines no longer carried their name. And yet, within this struggle lay the seed of the final transformation. For the first time, the Star began to realize that legacy was not about constant relevance, but about impact that lingers after the noise fades. The mentorship, the community projects, the brutally honest music, these things mattered not because they trended online, but because they touched lives directly. Fans who had been with them through every rise and fall continued to carry the story forward, sharing it with new audiences, ensuring that the name would not disappear even if the spotlight shifted elsewhere. Legacy, the Star began to understand, was not about staying on top forever, but about leaving behind something so real it couldn't be erased. The performances during this period reflected that shift in perspective. They were smaller, quieter, less about spectacle, and more about intimacy. Fans described them as almost spiritual, experiences where the connection mattered more than the size of the crowd. The Star no longer needed to prove worth to critics or rivals. These shows were for the people who had stayed, who had believed through every collapse, who had carried the story when the world tried to bury it. And in those rooms, filled with loyalty and love, the Star discovered something they had been chasing all along but never truly grasped: peace. But peace did not mean an end to challenge. The final test came in the form of one last controversy, smaller in scale than the ones that had nearly destroyed everything before, but potent enough to reignite old debates. A mistake, a poorly timed comment, an incident blown out of proportion by the ever-hungry media cycle. It threatened once again to undo the fragile stability that had been achieved. But this time, the Star handled it differently. Instead of spiraling into defensive battles or disappearing into silence, they met the moment with calm, honesty, and acceptance. They acknowledged imperfection, stood firm in growth, and refused to let the storm dictate their identity. Fans, instead of turning away, rallied harder, recognizing that what they were witnessing was not scandal, but strength. The final test had come, and the Star passed not by being flawless, but by being human. By the end of section 15, the story is no longer about survival in the face of chaos, but about acceptance in the face of inevitability. Fame had given everything and taken almost as much, but through every rise and fall, every scandal and reinvention, the Star had built something more powerful than applause: endurance, purpose, and a legacy that would outlast even their time in the spotlight. The narrative closes not with a dramatic fall or a perfect triumph, but with something deeper: the quiet realization that true victory lies not in never falling, but in always rising, again and again, until even the storms themselves run out of power. And so the story ends not with a collapse or a conquest, but with a truth too often forgotten in the glittering illusion of fame: that legacies are not built in headlines or scandals, but in the hearts of those who never stopped listening, never stopped believing, never stopped carrying the story forward. Fame fades, scandals blur, but resilience endures, and that endurance becomes the final chapter, the one that cannot be erased. In the end, the story of this Star is not a simple tale of fame won, lost and reclaimed. It is a reminder of the complicated truth that lies beneath every spotlight. Fame may look like perfection from the outside, but behind the curtain it is always a battle, one fought not only against critics and scandals, but against time, expectations, and the shadows of one's own mistakes. What makes this journey unforgettable is not that it was flawless, but that it was relentless, defined by the refusal to stay down even when the world seemed determined to bury everything they had built. Survival became the first chapter, reinvention became the second, and legacy became the third. Together, those chapters tell a story that is bigger than charts, headlines, or viral moments. They tell the story of endurance in its rawest form. The scandals that once threatened to erase everything now serve as reminders that resilience is not born in calm seas, but in storms. Every fall became part of the mythology, every mistake a scar that shaped the person behind the music. And though critics will always debate whether the redemption was authentic, whether the reinvention was calculated, or whether the legacy truly deserves to stand, the fact remains that few could have survived such relentless battles, and fewer still could have turned those battles into fuel for creativity. The art produced during these years will outlive the noise, and in that a kind of immortality is achieved. But perhaps the most powerful lesson to take from this story is that legacy is not about perfection, it is about impact. Fame fades quickly, scandals eventually blur into history, but the ability to connect with people, to move them, to inspire them to keep going when everything feels impossible, That is what remains. The star's willingness to show flaws, to own mistakes, to stumble and still rise again, created a mirror for fans who saw themselves in the struggle. And that connection, more than applause, more than awards, more than fleeting relevance, is what ensures the story will be remembered. The final act was not about conquering the industry or silencing every critic. It was about acceptance. Acceptance that relevance is temporary, that time cannot be defeated, but also that true victory lies in building something that survives beyond the moment. By embracing this truth, the star transcended the endless cycle of highs and lows that had once defined their career. They were no longer just a performer or a headline. They had become a figure whose story carried meaning, a reminder that even the most public falls can give way to something lasting if met with resilience. And so, the conclusion of this story is not really an ending, but a transition. The spotlight may dim, the roar of the crowd may soften, but the legacy remains, etched not in charts or scandals, but in the hearts of those who never stopped believing. It proves a simple but profound truth. You don't need to be perfect to matter. You only need to endure, to rise again, and to leave behind something that cannot be erased. And for this star, after everything they endured, that endurance itself became the legacy.